Hello and welcome to today's program, Insider Threat Assessments in Cybersecurity, Updates and Best Practices for Federal Contractors. On behalf of the Pacific Northwest Defense Coalition, I would like to thank Davis Wright Tremaine for inviting our members and guests to join us here at today's program. We have quite a few people joining us online as well as a few in the room here, so we welcome you all to today's program. Just as a double check here, for those joining us online, can you just verify that you can hear me okay and see the screen? If you just type yes in the question tab, we'll know that we've got a pretty good audio connection. Great, thanks. Looks like we're doing well on that. At any time during the program, you are welcome to ask a question. If you're joining us online, just type the question in that same question tab and we'll be able to read it to our presenters. And those of you in the room can also ask questions live. For those joining us online, there are a couple handouts available. There'll be a copy of today's presentation as well as a list of upcoming PNDC events. And for those in the room, I do have copies of the presentation if you'd like one as well right over here. We're pleased to have Jonathan DeMello and Lisa Marchese from Davis Wright and Tremaine presenting today. Really appreciate you lending your expertise to this program. This is important information that I know all our members will find very valuable. We'll have the live broadcast here today, and we'll also have a recording of this presentation. Both Lisa and John focus their practices on government counseling and litigation with extensive experience in federal contracting, compliance, and disputes. Lisa, I'll let you take things over. Let me get the audio set up here.
Well, based on the coin toss with John, I'm going first, and I'll leave it to you guys to decide who won or who lost. But be that as it may, John and I are really grateful to have the opportunity to be with you this morning on probably one of the hottest topics in government contracting that is posing the biggest risk and the biggest challenges for federal contractors. And so we appreciate the opportunity. As I said to a few of you before we started, we follow the regulations, we follow the developments, but it's really valuable for us to have the opportunity to interface with all of you to get feedback in terms of what's happening in the field. So we hope that we can learn from you as well as give you information today that hopefully will be of help to you and your respective practices. Let me see if I can. Technology and I don't always get along, which is a little funny to be giving a presentation like this. There we go, got it figured out. So John and I are going to talk about three basic things today. First, I think it's helpful when we talk about this subject is to briefly review some of the milestone events that have occurred that really shape and affect the mindset of the federal government when it comes to, issuing new regulations and imposing new compliance requirements on contractors. I think having an understanding of the breadth and scope of some of these events helps us understand why this is such a sea change and a constantly dynamic process. And there's two aspects that we're going to talk about. The first is the Insider Threat Program requirements, the new NIST Change 2 requirements that are going to affect federal contractors that have secured facilities. And we're going to talk a little bit about that because there's a compliance deadline coming up in a month. And then secondly, John is going to talk about the updates to cybersecurity, the new FAR and DFAR rules, and hopefully we both will give you some best practices and recommendations for how to grapple with this new regulatory environment. So really quickly, we know the headlines. The cyber threat affects private industry and the government alike. And if we look just in terms of trends, this is just a list in the PowerPoint of, in the last few years, all of the significant cyber events that have happened that have substantial breadth and scope. And again, this list is growing. This PowerPoint would be exponentially longer if we included all of them, but this just gives you an idea of the magnitude. The one place that I really want to start, though, is what has been commonly referred to as the Pearl Harbor cyber attack, which was the OPM breach, which was significant and substantial. And it's helpful to kind of think about what exactly happened, again, to kind of gain an understanding of where the government is most concerned and what goes into the drafting of regulations and compliance requirements. So we all remember a little over a year ago, in June of 2015, OPM came forward and announced that they'd been the target of a data breach. And what was significant about the initial announcement is OPM, as you all recall, initially said 4 million federal employees are affected. But less than a month later, in July of 2015, all of a sudden, that estimate of the affected people ballooned to 21.5 million, which, if you think about it, in terms of what was in place that enabled OPM to assess and identify the scope of the breach and the risk, was woefully inadequate. And what was very concerning is it wasn't just present employees, it was past, present employees and retirees. In fact, a couple of my colleagues who were former U.S. attorneys got their OPM notice letters. So it was a wide-ranging breach. In addition to the breach, it was the information that was targeted, which was social security numbers, date of births, home addresses. And then there were almost 6 million fingerprints that were part of the breach. Again, looking at this from a breach perspective and the implications, that was significant. As the investigation unwound, they found that the target of the hackers was focused in particularly on the form SF-86 that you all are probably familiar with, and this is the form that's filled out by employees when they're seeking a security clearance that enables the background investigation to proceed. And those of you that are familiar with this form know the scope of the information that's contained on the form SF-86. Who are your neighbors? Who are your friends? All of the information that would enable a hacker unbridled access and influence. So this was probably one of the most disturbing features of the breach. Kind of a couple final comments on the OPM situation. As we all know now, in subsequent reports to Congress, the evidence has mounted that the hackers were likely to be from China or connected with China. What's really disturbing about this is that based on the investigation post-mortem, it's pretty clear that they were able to move through the government databases for many years, install malware, install a backdoor, gradually increase their access to even more sensitive information. And what's sad is that the breach was only identified when OPM, almost inadvertently, when they were trying to update their system. OPM had received multiple warnings, but yet failed to act. And in fact, one of in the last report to Congress, basically about the forensic investigation that's relevant to our discussion, is the evidence looks pretty clear now that one of the hackers, or suspected one of the contractors that was part of this scheme to hack, had employees that were working for it that had Chinese passports. So again, that's something that really affects the mindset of the regulatory environment and subsequent regulations to both prevent this from happening not only with federal agencies but with federal contractors. So you have an environment of urgency that sometimes overrides the making of sound policy that's actually going to achieve the objective, which was preventing future breaches and protecting secure information. So that's the challenge that contractors are dealing with now. I want to talk a little bit about the Insider Threat Program as we segue into the NIST Change 2s that are going to come into effect. I keep this on my desk. I know John does. This is what we call the rules of the road, the NIST manual. In fact, I had to laugh. I grabbed it just to bring down, and I basically print this out like every couple months because of the changes. But this is the Bible, the National Industrial Security Program operations manual is really the Bible. It is the manual that defines the rules of the road for contractors who deal in classified information. And those of you that do defense contracting work are familiar with DSS, which is really the implementing agency, the agency that is responsible for ensuring NIST compliance and responsible for ensuring that federal contractors that are dealing with secure information are following the various requirements. Whenever I talk about NIST and DSS, the one thing I always like to point out is the compliance, DSS compliance doesn't just fall under Department of Defense contractors. DSS is the industrial security manager, not only for DoD, but for some 31 other agencies. The United States Trade Representative, for example, some DOT aspects that deal. So there's a wide swath and a wide range of federal agencies that DSS works for. So my footnote to this is, even if it's not a DoD contractor, you may be subject to DSS oversight and review if you're dealing with an agency and you're dealing with sensitive or cleared information. The reason why I kind of want to start with how DSS defines insider threat is I want to point out just a couple of things about this definition, because this really relates to all of the subsequent changes when we talk about you need to have a program in place, you need to have training in place. You need to keep this definition in mind. And this actually threads into what John's going to talk about on the cybersecurity new rules and regulations, because this is very consistent with the new regulations, which is to define insider threat very, very broadly. And you see the definition here. The key phrases that I want to point out to you in this definition is it's not just intentional conduct, it's unintentional conduct. And it's not conduct that actually causes a compromise, it's conduct that potentially could compromise the release of secured information. And that's a broad net. And it, again, keeping in mind the broad nature of this definition, the impact of that is on implementation and compliance, because it puts the onus on federal contractors to try to figure out, sometimes where there's not a lot of guidance on what is a potential threat, what is unintentional conduct. So bear in mind that these definitions now, and the current trend with the government is to broaden various definitions. FBI statistics have found that insider threats represent over 70% of cybersecurity threats, which is pretty astounding, and I think it elevates the importance of the insider threat program and the changes that are forthcoming now. So I've talked a little bit about the OPM security breach, the Pearl Harbor cyber attack, and the impact that's had on the regulatory environment, but I would certainly be remiss if I didn't talk about another event that also has had a substantial impact on the federal government and is at the core of a lot of the regulatory changes and the new laws we've seen in cyber. The GAO report, it's interesting, came out originally in April of 2015, before the OPM incident became public. It first came out in a classified version, and although the two individuals that really were the impetus for the GAO review and this report to Congress were not named by individually, it's very clear in the report who prompted this review and these recommendations. And those would be Edward Snowden, and secondly, it would be Bradley, I think it's Chelsea Manning, the Army officer who released all sorts of classified information to WikiLeaks. These were the two incidents that happened in tandem, again, within a short period of time of OPM discovering its cyber attack. But the GAO report is also something that it's something that it is a good reference document, and I think reading it, not only does it scare you to realize how ill-prepared the government was for these incidents, but it helps you understand the regulatory mindset. And here again, GAO found that essentially federal agencies were ill-prepared to deal with the Edward Snowdens, the Chelsea Mannings, and certainly what's kind of harrowing and scary is the things that GAO talked about were at the core of what was present or wasn't present that led to the OPM security breach. And this is more, you have it as the reference material, but one of the things about GAO and its report is the outgrowth of that was that federal contractors really became a particular point of emphasis, particularly after Edward Snowden. So not only was the government looking to template programs for its agencies, how its agencies would react and respond, and safeguards and programs, but as we'll see when we start talking about the NIST changes, that template has really been used, and the effort has been to apply that very template that agencies are following to contractors, which really heightens the compliance burden that that now all federal contractors are facing. So we've been talking about NIST. I want to turn and highlight the NIST Conforming Change 2 that was enacted back in May 18th of 20. It came into effect May 18th, 2016, but has a compliance obligation that's going to mature on November 30th. But basically, the NIST Conforming Change 2 now place new responsibility on federal contractors that hold facility clearances in 4 basic areas that I want to highlight for you. The first and probably the most immediate change that's going to happen is now these federal contractors that are holding facility clearances have to have a mandatory insider threat program written, compliant, and in effect by November 30th, which is, right around the corner. Additionally, as there are new cyber incident reporting requirements, which are somewhat, onerous, but the good news is they're very consistent with the FAR and the DFAR cyber reporting requirements that John's going to talk about. So the good news is oftentimes with federal compliance, you have a set of rules here and a set of rules there, and they often don't intersect. But I think the silver lining for government contractors is that the NIST Conforming Change 2s for reporting are very similar to and parallel in many respects the FAR and DFAR cyber reporting requirements. There are new NIST program components, and what I mean by that, and we'll highlight a few of them, is now under the manual there are new definitions that are rather broad that again affect the breadth and scope of compliance. Insider is broadly defined, insider threat is broadly defined, and we'll look at some of the key definitions that you need to be aware of as you think about putting together a compliant program. And lastly, national interest determinations, foreign controlled companies that hold facility security clearances, the NID process. There are differences or changes on how DoD is going to issue NID determinations for federal contractors that may be foreign controlled. We'll touch upon that very briefly. So let me just start and talk about probably the first and most immediate change is the mandatory insider threat program, the ITP. Cleared contractors have to have a written ITP plan in place no later than November 30th, 2016. And I've included the sites on the PowerPoint that hopefully, when John and I put these programs together, we always try to think about what would we want on our desk if we had a question. So we've included citations to the FARs, DFARs, and the manual where appropriate that'll hopefully allow you to access this in short order if you're addressing this question in your work. But one of the key things is there needs to be a designation of an ITP senior official. And this is different than an FSO, as you'll see, because the ITP senior official has more responsibilities and is subject to more rigorous training. However, the good news is there's no prohibition that the FSO can't serve as the ITP senior official. And based on the feedback and the commentary thus far, the prevailing view would be that your FSO is probably in the best position to assume the responsibilities that now are imposed under the ITP to serve as the ITP senior official. So not only is there a requirement for a special ITP senior official, there's different training, and the training is far more rigorous than just say your other cleared personnel. For example, there's training on the legal consequences of a security breach. There's training on the national security consequences. So it's pretty wide-reaching training. The good news is, and we'll get to it a little bit in a few slides down, is this is one area where there actually is a lot of published guidance that will help you in terms of compliance when you look at this. But it's important to be aware of kind of the unique features that Conforming Change 2 is going to impose. Not only in terms of training, not only is there specialized training for your ITP senior official, but your cleared personnel now have to go through training, and it's different, and it's, again, that's more rigorous than perhaps what you're used to, and that has to be done annually thereafter and certified to DSS. And by the way, I neglected to say, with regard to the ITP senior official, that training for the ITP senior official must be done within 30 days of the appointment, or essentially you have a month to not only designate your senior official, but make sure your senior official completes the requisite training. Yes?
Excuse me, Lisa, and I'm poking up my question.
No, absolutely. We absolutely love that. So great.
When was the mandate or strong encouragement around the program? When was that released? A month is, I mean, for all intents and purposes, now.
The initial recommendations were released in 2014. I believe, and I can provide you the website of where they came. The final hasn't been released that long. I think it was May of 2016. But we have in a few slides, we have the website where that guidance and information is obtained. But you're absolutely right. It has not been available for very long for folks. No, that's a good question. Thank you for that. The third aspect is this self-inspection, which, again, this also came into being the actual final inspection, and there's actually on the DSS and the NIST websites, there's actually a checklist you can access, which I would highly recommend that you do, because there is a new requirement of self-inspection, and not only self-inspection, but self-inspection done annually with a new certification requirement that you must make to DSS that you've completed this self-inspection. What I want to, in terms of resources, DSS actually publishes a self-inspection handbook, and I think that's the safest course of action, is that you access the DSS self-inspection handbook. There's a checklist. The NIST checklist is contained in there, and that's the best way, most efficiently, to adopt this requirement, and you make sure that it's part of your written program. So change 2, and this is probably where I said the silver lining is, there are new NIST requirements for the reporting of cyber incidents. And as I've indicated here, these revisions, and John's going to spend a little bit more time talking about, obviously, the FAR and DFAR requirements, but the silver lining for us is that these new NIST requirements track very, very closely with the FAR and DFAR requirements. So in terms of coming up with a compliance program, it really can be one-stop shopping. You don't need to have a separate set of rules for cleared facilities and a separate set of rules for everything else. So the good news is that there's a good parallel between the cyber reporting requirements for the NIST Conforming Change 2 and the new FAR DFARs. As you see cyber incidents, and we'll kind of dovetail with this in the next change, again, it's a broad definition. It's a consistent definition of what constitutes a cyber incident. Cleared defense contractors have basically 3 requirements under NIST if a cyber incident occurs. Again, very similar to the FAR and DFARs, that basically you have to report on the methods that were used. You have to provide samples of any malicious software that was used, and then you have to summarize not only the actual but the potentially compromised information. So a lot of thought and deliberation needs to go into this, and again, it's helpful to have a program and a protocol in place so that you can act quickly. And the other feature of this to be aware of is that if there is an incident, DoD and probably DSS will have access to your equipment and information, and they get full access, and you need to be prepared to grant them full access. And the litmus test that they use, access to anything that's necessary to conduct a forensic analysis. We've assisted some contractors with preliminary investigations, and I can tell you, and it's probably consistent with what you all know, DSS takes a very broad approach to what constitutes what's necessary to conduct a forensic analysis. So the best thing I can tell you is just be prepared that they're going to have access to everything if there is a cyber incident. The more comprehensive your report is, though, that they often will use that as a guide and follow that, so you can prevent kind of this whole scale, top to bottom undressing and looking at everything. So again, having a good protocol in place for if there's an actual or suspected breach, that really is your best protection.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Since it's tracking FAR and DFAR, the NIST requirements, will they also have limitations for size, not only company, but also the size of the federal contract?
That's a great question.
Can we have you repeat the question? They're having a little, or at least paraphrase it.
The reason is many of the people in PNDC are small companies, and they may have a federal contract, but it may be under the DFAR ceiling requiring a lot of this kind of so they don't need to have this program in place by now.
Well, the litmus test for the NIST compliance is if you're you're a cleared facility, you're a cleared defense contractor. So it really, if you have access to classified information, the size and dollar threshold won't come into play, at least for NIST.
Okay.
But that's an excellent question, because the security contracts that involve secured information have wide-ranging dollar value, and so this is something, again, if your folks have access to protected information, you need to be aware that NIST, and that's part of why at the very beginning when I talked about DSS is that a lot of smaller contractors think if it's not a DoD contract, maybe we don't have to think in terms of this, but really the guiding principle should be, do I have cleared employees? Do I, do we have access to protected information? That's really what the compliance mechanism that would be triggered.
Okay, thank you.
There are 4 new definitions in the NIST manual now from Conforming Change 2 that I just want to highlight because they will impact the compliance program that you put in place. Again, adverse information was a definition that got a lot of attention. It's a very broad definition, and it's anything that basically would reflect upon the integrity or character of a cleared employee that suggests that I've got Edward Snowden working for me, or potentially the next Edward Snowden. So it's a broad definition. We've talked already about cybersecurity and the new definitions, but we see the definition of cybersecurity now, which again is a broad definition, but is also consistent with the FARs and DFARs. Who is an insider? This is another thing that is very broad because it's not just an employee. It's anybody that you could have a relationship with that would have access to information. So being aware of how NIST is going to view who an insider is. Similarly, insider threat. Here again, it's where is the threat coming from to the organization, and thinking beyond just the folks that may actually be on the payroll, but it's those with access that you interface with. And a couple of quick comments. The national interest determinations, this tends to be a very small area of affected contractors because we don't have that many contractors that are foreign control that do work on classified government contracts, and if they do, there's an NID issued by DoD that allows for and determines that this work is in the national security interest of the United States, so we're going to allow it under these very strict circumstances. But I included it here because it's the kind of the fourth major feature of the NIST Conforming Change 2 revisions, that there's now a new process for a foreign-controlled contractor and the issuance of NIDs. So the last slide I want to talk about before I turn it over to John is we've kind of looked at what these changes entail, but we wanted to leave you with some takeaways of if you are faced with compliance, if you're under NIST and subject to DSS oversight and review, there's kind of three best practices that we offer you, and I think these apply too to looking at FAR and DFAR compliance, but specifically to the Conforming Change 2 revisions. My recommendation, or our recommendation, would be think about establishing an insider threat program committee internally, and it's a committee that should involve your legal folks, your HR folks, your IT folks, and management, and that should be a committee that meets regularly to talk about and make sure that compliance programs are in effect, that they're being followed, that issues that come up are being addressed. So I strongly urge that would be a good mechanism to facilitate compliance. Similarly, because there is such overlap between the FAR and DFARs that John's going to talk about in just a moment and the new NIST requirements, you can establish a coordinated cyber security compliance and insider threat program. So if you're faced with compliance both places, really take advantage of that in coming up with a coordinated implementation plan. And then, lastly, establish a process for reviewing and using available DSS and industry organization resources. And this is where I wanted to kind of leave you in a written form. The good news here is DSS has actually published a lot of information that would be very helpful, like the self-inspection checklist. The DSS Industrial Security Letter, which can be accessed online, is very helpful and provides lots of good guidance. We've already talked about the self-inspection handbook, and then industry organizations too have published materials that are very helpful. The National Classification Management Society publications have all been pretty good and pretty helpful. So there are resources available. It's just knowing where to look and having in your mind as you address compliance what's important. And really, I think it comes down, and let me leave you with three questions that I think will help kind of how you approach this and putting together an effective compliance program. I think that the first thing you should ask yourself is, what are your most important assets? What are the crown jewels of your business? And having an understanding of what those most important assets are should be first and foremost at the fore. And then secondly, bearing in mind the broad definitions that you're now faced with, who are the insiders? Who are the people, both employed or have a relationship, who are the ones that have access to inside information? I think it's really important at the core of looking at compliance is you have an understanding of who potentially is a threat. And then lastly, and I think most importantly, is whatever you do in terms of a compliance program, you have to organize and make sure that that you have a culture that protects yourself and your business. And that's one of the inherent tensions that we have, is that we cannot be so draconian in eliminating risk that we compromise the important business culture that we need to have in place that motivates our employees and makes them want to understand, agree, and comply with the various regulatory requirements that we're now faced with. So those are the three questions in tandem with best practices that I leave you with. With that, let me turn it over to my partner, John, who's going to walk you through the other aspects of cybersecurity.
And if I may, just a quick reminder to those joining us online, you're welcome to type your question in. And I guess people online are having a little bit hard time hearing the questions. So John, or Lisa, if you get any additional questions, if you could just paraphrase them back when you're answering them, that would be great.
Sure. So Lisa had, during her remarks, had mentioned a regulatory mindset in connection with the OPM breach and Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning. And I just wanted to start off with that because I couldn't agree more that the regulatory mindset right now among the federal agencies that are dealing with cybersecurity is one of focused, laser-like attention on these particular rules. I've been doing government contracts for about 15 years, and you'll see over the course of years, periods of time where federal agencies, they have an issue that garners their particular attention. You'll see regulations come out. I've not seen, certainly cybersecurity is an issue like that, and I don't believe I've seen an issue that has resulted in so many comprehensive, complex regulations that impose requirements, compliance requirements included, on contractors that have very quick turnaround times and really, I don't think, are sympathetic to the realities of businesses, including small businesses, that are forced to, number one, understand these regulations, because as we will discuss, they're not always the clearest, and number two, bear the burden. I mean, certainly the risk is being shifted from the agencies that were initially tasked with addressing this issue onto contractors, but compliance is, as you can see on the slide here, it's costly, it's burdensome, and non-compliance, if we want to continue being a federal contractor, is not really an option. So that is something that I think makes this topic one that is incredibly timely and will continue to be incredibly timely. In connection with the regulations that we're going to be, oh, those are nice. So I had, so we. Be impressed with your own presentation. Excuse me for everyone. So yes, we. I had a rather dull looking presentation that has since been dressed up, and I very much appreciate that. So as far as the goals for today are concerned, what I'd like to do is review some select, and I say select, I'll get to that in a moment, recent cybersecurity regulations and guidance. By recent, we have two regulations, two final rules that have been issued in the last 4 weeks, one of which is the DFARS rule. One affects the DFARS rule that we're going to be discussing today. The FAR rule that Lisa mentioned was promulgated in June of this year. As you'll see, as you sort of unpack and look at these regulations, you are forced to follow, the bouncing ball through guidance and directives, and we're not going to go, very deep into that process, but certainly one of the things that I want to do is give you a sense of what you should be looking for, provide an overview so you understand it, and you will have a means by which to discuss and then begin your thoughts for compliance. Number two, identify the types of information and information systems. I draw that distinction between information, covered information, and covered contractor information systems because the regulations do. In the FAR regulation, the focus is on information systems. In the DFARS rule, it's both, and we're going to talk about that distinction and make sure that hopefully everyone understands it and can move forward with their cybersecurity compliance programs in an efficient, meaningful, and thoughtful way. And third, we will review how contractors are going to be affected by these regulations and guidance. And like I enjoyed Lisa's questions, those sort of thought-provoking questions. I think that that's something that I'd certainly invite from our online audience. And then as we go forward, please, if you have a question, hold up your hand and let's discuss the ways in which you think that we can, number one, we can describe the effect, and number two, best meet the challenge of compliance. So the first regulation that I'd like to look at, and this is the one that was very recently updated a week ago, is the DFARS regulation regarding cybersecurity, and we're going to spend a bit of time on this. The title of it, Safeguarding Covered Defense Information and Cyber Incident Reporting. Just so that we all understand the relationship between the regulations here, this is a Department of Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation supplement to the FAR. So this applies to DoD contracts. You'll have to look in your contract and see if the clause is in there, but it will stand very likely in addition to the FAR clause that we're going to discuss a little later on. This one's first because we're PNDC, and I thought that it was appropriate. It's also the more onerous of the two, so I think that you know, this one is a good place to start. The substance of the clause, what does it say? What does it do? What does it require of you? It requires you as a contractor to provide adequate security on all covered contractor information systems. And every time you see quotes, as I was putting this together, every one of these is a definition. When you see that, and it leads to more definitions and to more burden on you to really understand. So, like I mentioned, we're going to go through some of these, but this is intended to provide an overview of what is required by this particular clause. You'll see in the next bullet there's a reference to NIST SP 800-171. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They are a federal agency tasked with, among other things, identifying the particular requirements and security controls that government contractors must adhere to based on a process that we will discuss when they have a covered contractor information system, which I also, it is in quotes. So we'll take a look at that. And then finally, what's important in connection with some of the other questions regarding when. We have a requirement in the DFARS that says that contractors shall comply by December 31st, 2017, but really should be seeking to do this as soon as practical, as soon as possible. So we have a bit of time. The very last slide, it will address some of the issues, the questions regarding small business. That period of time you'd think is sensitive to perhaps small businesses and other companies that are being forced to comply with these regulations, but you're going to see in the comments that were issued on the final rule that will ultimately affect this regulation last week, there is a distinct insensitivity to small businesses and the requirements that they must face. But that's a few slides ahead. Like Lisa had mentioned, these definitions, I'm going to start with covered contractor information system. It's a broad definition, and if you look at it, I see there are two clauses, two parts of this definition that I want to draw your attention to. One is a contractor that processes, stores, or transmits. Very broad. If you have an information system that processes, stores, or transmits covered defense information, then you have a covered contractor information system. You're going to be subject to that particular clause. Now, like I mentioned, we're going to be following the definitions through these regulations to get a better handle on it. We look at covered defense information within the definition of contractor or covered contractor information systems, and we have another definition that was just clarified last week. Now, in earlier iterations of the DFARS clause, there were 4 basic categories of covered defense information. There was controlled technical information, critical information for operations security, export control information, and then a catch-all, information that more or less required safeguarding or dissemination controls. What you see now is a direction to controlled unclassified information, or CUI, and a registry, the website is there, that requires the safeguarding or dissemination controls pursuant to regulations that we're going to be talking about today. And under those two hash marks, you will see that this definition is indeed very broad. It's information that's provided to the contractor under number 1 by DoD, or 2, collected, developed, received, transmitted, used, or stored by or on behalf of the contractor in support of the performance of the contract. So again, the idea here is that these are incredibly broad definitions intended to really catch everybody within the scope of this rule so that there's no reasonable way to get out of it. One other point that I'd like to make in connection with, that's a bit of good news, in connection with the change that came out last week. The new definition excludes commercial off-the-shelf items. Now, this was in the FAR rule that we'll talk about. It was not in the DFARS rule, but now, thankfully, if you have a contract for the procurement of commercial off-the-shelf items, you should not expect, with DoD, you should not expect to see the DFARS clause that we're talking about here in that contract. And if you do see it, you should definitely push back. Yes?
It sounds like, to me, a product as opposed to a design.
That's right. It's something that, exactly, something that you would get off of one of the schedules, something that I would think, perhaps for the individuals, companies that are listening in the room now, it's not the best of news. I don't know if you're really selling commercial off-the-shelf items, but it's there nonetheless.
As a protection of memberships, and to include within that discussion, certainly asking the question of your providers, your current contractors, in terms of what are their hardening mechanisms and processes, and have them determine and provide that information to you in writing is strongly encouraged.
Yeah, and I think with that's a great point, because
repeat the question.
I'll
Paraphrase. Yeah.
Right. So the issue is whether this commercial off-the-shelf exception is really something, an exclusion that I think would be a meaningful exclusion for members within the defense industry sector. And I think that the answer, a couple of points to make. One, unless you are providing a commercial off-the-shelf item, the obvious answer is no. But something to take into account, which is an excellent point. When you had mentioned, I thought of your subcontract supplier and the flow-down requirements. You, as a prime contractor, may be dealing with other suppliers and subcontractors that have to perform work that would be covered by or work in the performance of the contract. They might have covered defense information, but with this exclusion, if you have an understanding that they are providing a commercial off-the-shelf item, that flow down wouldn't necessarily apply. I don't know if that hits exactly what you were getting at, but
Good point. If you don't mind, I can paraphrase what you had said. One, identify what your current policies, procedures, and products are.
mm-hmm.
It might be a procedural or a policy or a system intention, less product-oriented. And please, if I'm misstating something there. But the importance to that is throughout that process, downline or upline, identifying the hardening policies and procedures of those commercial off-the-shelf products and policies.
Thank you
And
very much.
get them in writing.
Yeah, and that is going to be a dialogue that I suspect, depending upon what side, sub or prime you're on, you will undoubtedly be taking part in. Yes?
Isn't the concern in a lot of ways, though, related to the broad nature of the wording, that it's not necessarily processes, but it's also everything else that's stored within a CRM or the information that could be within a customer or a contracted vendor in their system. They're outsourcing that to a third party. It's being controlled and protected, yet there's no, they don't really have any control over how that's secured, yet they're still going to be on the hook in the event of a breach, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly, in the event of a breach, and we'll come to that a little later on. So the question is whether the breadth of this particular clause is one in which it's not merely focused on processes, but would also have implications for, as a prime contractor or first-tier subcontractor, being responsible for potential incidents and threats down the line. And the answer to that is yes. It's definitely a concern. We have later on in the slides, I pulled the full text of the flowdown requirement, and I think that when we have that in front of us, we can take a closer look at it. But what we're going to see is that it's relatively unforgiving for those prime contracts and upper tiers, and that given the breadth and scope of these definitions, you as the prime, and if you are a sub, required to comply, will need to enter into that dialogue with your subs to ensure that you have a very clear understanding of what is and is not covered defense information on a covered defense information system, and ultimately whether or not you would need to comply. Now, this may be a good place to pause. When I was preparing for this, I did look for some of the larger defense contractor guidance. What are they saying with respect to their subs and compliance and lower tier with respect to compliance with this particular regulation? What I found was it wasn't very helpful. It was a brief overview saying you better get ready, you better review, you better understand. Here's some really scary things about this clause. We're going to flow it down into your contracts. Call us if you have any questions. And that more or less was the way I saw. I mean, we're talking about your major, maybe your top 25, that level defense contractors. But nevertheless, I think that this mindset is the regulations. And this goes back to a statute that was issued in the early 2002. First focused on the federal agencies, and the federal agencies are now driving those regulations onto federal prime contractors, and now those federal prime contractors, it's continuing down. So I think that's what we're going to be seeing, and I think that's going to be part of the dialogue that we'll have as these regulations continue to be promulgated. And that's one other thing that I'll mention right now. These regs, including the two that came out in the last month or so, they both indicate that we can expect to see more. This is a first step in these regulations. The government is, although there is some similarity between the insider threat requirements that Lisa discussed and the cybersecurity requirements and the DFARS and the FAR clause, the agencies themselves, particularly the civilian agencies, they're still, we're talking about 16 years after FISMA, which is the statute that started all this, they're still getting their arms around what this really means, the implications for the agencies, and how they're going to deal with it with contractors.
You're going to go into penalties and other types of...
we can talk about that. The penalties are something that are not specifically addressed as part of this presentation, but it's something that we obviously do need to discuss. When I had initially said that non-compliance is not an option, some of these regulations are so new that in looking at how in practice is this going to be enforced through either breach of contract, through loss of the contract, through other default procedures, that is something where I think we need to get a better handle on. And
because there's monetary implications on the contract that you currently have, and then the loss of it associated later on obviously is an impact that company as well.
As well as whether or not you would be deemed responsible. And that's, I mean, that's a separate determination, right? I mean, if you are one of those contractors that do not comply within the time frame, right, or you are otherwise in violation of these rules, that focus, that regulatory mindset is something where I think there's little doubt that there are going to be direct implications for that. In fact, one of the, just before I came down, because this is moving so fast, I'm going to check Law 360, which is one of our reporters, and see if anything comes up for today. And the top article was DoD cyber teams now trained, up, and ready. Okay, the mission of the DoD Cyber Mission Force, and that's these teams, is defending the integrity of the DoD's networks and keeping information secure, conducting cyber operations in support of combatant commands, and if necessary, defending U.S. networks more broadly, particularly critical infrastructure. So I think, even as recently as today, this focus shall continue, and my sense is that contracting officers who are interpreting these particular regulations will be of the same regulatory mindset that we have with our cyber force here, and that the practical consequences will be very real. But I think that's to answer your question more specifically, that's something where I think we need to see how it's actually going to come into play. The DFARS rule, we still have another 13 months to get up to compliance on that, although that's not the case with the FAR rule that we'll discuss in a minute. Okay, so moving forward, I am going to be done by noon. I never go over. So moving forward, the covered defense information, like I had mentioned, refers to this CUI registry, this Controlled Unclassified Information Registry. Now, what is that? This is a background slide, and one of the things, like Lisa mentioned, that I chose to do in the preparation of this presentation is to give you information that may be more dense than otherwise may be. What I'd like here is just focus on that third bullet point, the Executive Order 13556. What we see is that that executive order, which was issued back in 2010 by President Obama, began this Controlled Unclassified Information Program and designated the National Archives as the agency responsible for that program. And what they've done is created a website that identifies controlled, unclassified information that, as you go back up through the DFARS clause, will constitute your covered defense information. So you have to understand what it is and what's on that website to really understand whether you have covered defense information. What I've done in the first bullet point is I've just listed some of the primary or the major categories that we see on that registry. And in the second bullet point, I chose one that I thought would be of particular interest to this discussion, and that's controlled technical information. So you see the first pass mark, you have as we've discussed, a broad definition. And in the second, take a look at the particular examples because they are illustrative. You have engineering data, drawings, specs, standards, process sheets, manuals, tech reports, and so on. So if you have an information system, okay, that has this in it, okay, and that information process, stores, or transmits this type of information, then you have covered defense information within a covered defense information system. You're going to be subject to that clause and the particular requirements under that clause that we're going to talk about. And I'd urge all of you, if you haven't already been to the registry, to go take a look at it, because it will give you a direct understanding of what it is the archives has identified as controlled, the controlled information, unclassified information, as well as what's going to be covered defense information. I add one more thing to that. One of the recent rules for the FAR, even the non-defense agencies have indicated that this particular registry will be the repository for both defense and non-defense. So even if you're dealing with the VA, a contract with a non-defense agency, this is where you're going to go to understand whether you have controlled unclassified information. All right, so if we recall from the first overview slide that we looked at on this DFARS clause, there was a reference to National Institute of Standards and Technology, Special Publication 800-171. If you don't have it, if you haven't printed it out, please do so, because this is something you will need to read, study, and understand if you are at all dealing with systems that may fall beneath these clauses. So that NIST was identified as being triggered upon having a covered contractor information system, and it was also specifically identified in the clause by stating that the contractor shall implement the SP 800-171 controls by December 31, 2017. So it's a direct, not like many other DFARS clauses. This is a direct reference in the clause to this particular publication. And I have a copy of it. I have a copy of it here. If you'd like to take a look, it's not as large as some of the others, but it certainly is. Something that requires significant study. So what is it? The purpose. We can look at purpose, application, and I'd like to look at specific requirements. And then we're going to go do a bit of a dive and then come back out. The purpose is to provide federal agencies recommended requirements for the protection of the confidentiality of controlled unclassified information. And it applies to all components of non-federal information systems. By non-federal, that means us. Non-federal means contractor. So that's what they're talking about here. And again, you see the reference to information systems that process, store, or transmit CUI or provide security. Now, the control requirements that are set forth in this document are divided among two types of classifications. One are basic security requirements. The other are enhanced or supplemental, or what the regulation describes as derived security requirements. The first one, the core security requirements, are in a document. It's called a FIPS publication, which also you should take a look at, and I included here for your reference. FIPS is Federal Information Processing Standard. It's published by the National Archives. And this is a document that was issued in 2006 and identifies these core requirements. 853, Special Publication 853, was issued in 2013. You'll also need to study that. Now, this next slide, what I've done here is I've included this, I've cut and pasted a paragraph from FIPS 200 so that you can see the process for security control selection. And essentially, for purposes of today, and we could spend 2 hours on this and working through the selection of the particular security controls at least, but take away that it's essentially a multi-step, or more specifically, primarily a two-step process. The first of which is you go forward with a security categorization of federal information. That's in another FIPS document, 199, which is there for your reference. It's divided into 3 types of potential impacts upon the loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability from your system, low, moderate, or high, okay? And those three classifications, your basic security categorization of the information that you have, tie out to the impact. If you think that a breach is going to lead to a limited adverse impact, it's low, serious, moderate, catastrophic, high. Once you've done that, you then have to select the appropriate security control. How do you select the appropriate security control? You look back at 800-171, and what I've done here on this slide is identified the 14 families of security controls that appear in Special Publication 800-171. And in thinking about how to present this, I realized that this may not mean much, but these particular families have evolved through the documents, through the FIPS documents that I just mentioned, and I thought that I would give you just a few examples of what they're actually asking you to do. So you see access control there. The basic requirements, okay, these are not the enhanced protocols, just the basic requirement. Limit information access to authorized users. In connection with the awareness and training requirement, ensure organizational personnel are adequately trained. So even right there, as far as best practices, recommended practices go, if you don't have training right now to ensure that your organization understands everything that we're talking about today, you are not going to comply with the basic security control requirement under awareness and training. In connection with, and I'm not going to go through everyone, but just a few more. Incident response, again, basic requirement. Track, document, report incidents to appropriate officials and authorities. Well, we better be able to track, we better be able to document, we better have an appropriate in-house official that can hear this, and then we better have a means and an understanding to make a reporting when that's done. In connection with the media protection family, protect, physically control and store information system media containing CUI, both paper and digital. Well, how are we going to do that? How are we going to physically protect this information? We train our people. Do they have particular passwords on their iPhones? Do they have lock boxes in their offices? Are information systems in secure areas? Those are the sorts of things in connection with media protection, which has a physical component that we would need to be aware of. Connection with personnel security, screen individuals prior to authorizing access to info systems containing CUI. I don't know exactly when this screening would take place, but we would need to ultimately have some process in place to understand exactly who is going to have access to CUI. And remember, the CUI definitions are broad, so if you're an organization where you have a fluid, dynamic sort of relationship among your various personnel as you're responding to contract requirements, performing contract requirements, you need to think about these things and understand, how am I going to do it? I mean, how am I going to comply? And that's why I say, December 31st, 2017 may seem like long, but it's not long enough. Yes?
So, real quickly, not only for the contractor, but also up and down line within the supply chain. It's
Absolutely.
Very impactful around this entire arena.
Absolutely. And yes.
Do the guidelines require polygraph and regular polygraph testing?
I didn't see that, but that very well may be in the enhanced security controls. And we could certainly go back and check. I mean, one of the great things about these documents that you have online, the 800-171 requirements, they will map to another set of requirements. Like I've said, these are dizzyingly complex in the sense that the government, the left hand doesn't necessarily know what the right is doing. They've not really consolidated all of these requirements into a document where, if you're a DoD contractor, the contracting officer, or there could be a publication that says, here, this for your cybersecurity requirements. this is your mapping. This is the collection of rules and regulations you must comply with. Instead, it requires constant vigilance to understand and have what's probably 2 or 3 inch binders worth of material that you're going to have to study just to get a sense of what the regs are, what you're dealing with as far as compliance, and then you obviously have to have the procedure to map through. Once you go through your categorization, that first step to understand which particular security control requirements are applicable to you. Yes?
I think this goes back to our first presentation, the importance of having this committee within your agency that is responsible for overseeing the training, compliance, as it were, for this. You almost have to have that, but it seems to me.
You would need to have that, or if you're a small business, you need an officer. You need to have someone who's, and this is not a small job. I mean, this is an ongoing job. This is not something where you're going to say, okay, HR, we have to screen individuals. Why don't you also be our chief cybersecurity officer? Because that's just not going to work. I mean, this is going to require HR. It's going to require a chief information officer. It's going to require, like Lisa mentioned, legal. It's going to require coming together with a number of different individuals so that you have, ideally, a comprehensive plan to say, if tasked or asked the question, I'm compliant, and here it is. It's just that it's obviously important. Lisa began this presentation discussing the extent of these cyber attacks, and they continue and will continue, but it's going to be very, very challenging, I think, for even the larger companies to understand what those requirements are, and for the smaller companies to meaningfully comply because they are so burdensome and so costly. So this particular slide right here, we've talked about this. This just summarizes the process that we just discussed, with the exception of the first, which is review and apply the clauses in the contract. This is critically important, not only because you need to know whether the DFARS clause or the FAR clause is in fact in your contract, but also because what we've seen is contracts that have unique security requirements clauses that you may also need to comply with. And hopefully that will be, as the government, as the agencies get a better understanding of what it is they want to do, that will all begin to narrow into this group of control requirements that we see on the registry, and the particular requirements that we're seeing, and the other guidance that we can look to time and again to understand what's really required instead of some unique clause. All right, I'm going to get a move on here. So the other aspect of the clause, of the DFARS clause that I wanted to talk about, everything we just talked about you can put under the rubric of safeguarding, right? Okay, there's also a reporting requirement upon identification of a cyber incident. Cyber incident, you see the definition there, that is within the DFARS clause. Unfortunately, cyber incident is not elsewhere defined. It's not defined in the FAR, it's not defined in other, at least in the unclassified information realm, as far as I know. It's not elsewhere defined in the regulations, including those that just came out. So there's going to be continuing ambiguity as to what is a triggering event, although I think if you have a compromise, most companies would want to err on the side of caution and initiate their reporting process. What is it that you have to do upon the identification of a cyber incident? Very briefly, conduct a review for evidence of compromise within of covered defense information, which we've talked about. Analyze the covered contractor information systems that were part of the cyber incident. Again, these are very broad. I mean, conduct, analyze, what that really means. Well, we have a bit of insight into that coming up, but it remains both broad and vague. Third hash mark, one of the much talked about, including in this last iteration of the final DFARS rule that came out last week, rapidly report. Instead of just saying report within 72 hours of discovery, they define rapidly report to mean within 72 hours of discovery. Companies pushed back and said, are you kidding me, that's way too fast. And DoD said, no, it's not. So it remains within 72 hours of discovery. You must also preserve and protect images of all known affected information for at least 90 days for the submission of your report, which means you're going to have the sophistication I'm now roaming outside of my comfort area. Image, you're going to have to preserve that in some way with your IT professionals so that you have a snapshot of what occurred and you can understand what it was that what was compromised, despite the fact that you're not going concerned.
That doesn't follow 90 days. I would say there's absolutely
no, that's 90 days. And lastly, upon request, we need to provide the DoD with access to additional information and our systems to conduct forensic analysis. And while that may not seem like such a bad thing in and of itself, what DoD has done is engage third-party contractors to assist with the incident response and with the forensic analysis, which means that when you turn over your information, you're not turning it over to the United States government per se, you're turning it over to another contractor. And if you have proprietary information in there, if you have confidential information, if you have trade secrets, that's all going to be within the hands of a third-party supplier, and the remedy is you can sue. And that's frankly not good enough. And that was stated that was identified as a comment last week, and again, not met with any sort of meaningful response. It remains the rule. divnet.dod.mil. There's a website that DoD has set up for you to initiate your report. I'm not going to go through all this. It's there for your perusal, but I'll draw your attention to numbers 10, 11, and 19. Some of these are, ministerial, I would say, administrative. Others are not. Impact to cover defense information, ability to provide operationally critical support, and an incident compromise narrative. Again, this is all within 72 hours that you're going to be providing this, not 90, right? I mean, so very quickly that once you learn of this, you must mobilize, you must go on to DivNet and provide this particular information, which means that you're going to need to be nimble and fast and able if you're going to meet the reporting requirement. Flow down. This is a cut and paste of paragraph M of the current DFARS clause. I'll draw your attention to the third line, and the question is really, does subcontract performance involve covered defense information? If it does, it flows down. Take a look at that. We can have an ongoing discussion about, and we will, about what this means, but it's certainly, in my view, means that most subcontractors not providing COTS items and suppliers not providing commercial off-the-shelf items will need to consider whether they are subject to this rule. And if you're a prime, for your safety's sake, you're going to need to go into an analysis of whether you should flow this down. Okay, so that was the DFARS rule. I'd like to move to the FAR rule. Okay, DFAR, and that is at 52-204-21, titled Basic Safeguarding of Contractor Information Systems. It was issued May 16th of this year, effective date June 15th, which means it's effective now. It adds a FAR subpart, which we should all read. It has broad application, as you can see. All acquisitions, including acquisitions of commercial items other than COTS items, when a contractor's information system may contain federal contract information. Should put that in quotes. Here are some important definitions for you. They are, as I feel like I'm a broken record here, these are also broad. Okay, and if you look at them, you will see that they are particularly broad. There are some similarities to what we've seen in the DFARS rule. Processes, stores, or transmits federal contract information. The other two definitions, though, what you don't see here, controlled unclassified information, you don't see a reference to the registry or those categories that we just discussed. The substance of this rule is that it applies 15 security controls when this shows up in your clause. And like I just mentioned, there's no reference to the registry and the particular controls. There's no direct reference to the NIST standards, 800-171, or the legacy standard, 853. It was really the genesis for these particular standards. So you have to look at these. Now, if you're dealing with a non-DoD contract, you have this clause. It's active. It's in effect right now. It means that you have to comply with this now. Now, what the government has said, the FAR Council, in its infinite wisdom or not, depending on how you want to treat it, is that these are the bare minimum basic requirements that federal agencies must comply with. So we're just flowing that down to you. And they also warn, as stated in that second paragraph, or second bullet here, that this is not going to relieve you of any other specific control requirements that you may find in your contract. So you may have a contracting officer, for whatever reason, that imposes those particular registry requirements and the NIST requirements that we saw, which means that you're going to be mapping to those particular requirements that are more onerous than presumably these 15 that are identified here. And then finally, like we've been talking about, this clause also has a flow down that, if you look at the last clause here, on the last bullet, in which the subcontractor may have federal contract information residing in or transiting through its information system. So again, for both subs and primes, you're going to have to engage in that dialogue to understand whether or not you really are required to flow this down, and if you're a sub, to push back on it and say, no, I'm not. Conclusions on taking away from the FAR clause, we've talked about this, or I've mentioned it. I'll point out the FAR Council noted that this is reflective of actions a prudent business person would employ, these 15 requirements. So they really are stressing the idea that this is the bare minimum. And just in case there wasn't any doubt regarding scope and applicability, it's very broad because this rule requires only the most basic level of safeguarding. I think most people would disagree. The other points we've talked about throughout in remarks so far, and it's just an ongoing concern regarding lack of uniformity among these particular regulations. That we're going to see more of these regulations, and that hopefully they will be harmonized as the burden continues to shift to contractors. Two final updates that I'd like to go over before we close. First, September 14th, last month, the National Archives issued a final rule amending its regulations on controlled unclassified information. Go to the third bullet point there. It applies to executive agencies, but also indirectly to contractors and other information sharing partners through incorporation into agreements. What does this mean? Although it applies to agencies, those agencies are being told to incorporate this rule into their contracts. And I shouldn't just say contracts because they specifically stated it's not just contracts. It's grants, licenses, certificates, agreements, and other types of arrangements that you may have with your civilian, federal civilian agencies with whom you're contracting. It also emphasizes and reinforces the significance of the CUI registry as the exclusive means of designating CUI throughout the executive branch. That's not just DoD. So some takeaways, implications regarding this rule. Very briefly, we can expect to see another FAR subpart and clause that imposes safeguarding requirements for CUI. And I should have noted in the FAR clause that we looked at, if I didn't note, there's no mention of CUI. So now the National Archives are saying we're going to align, we're moving toward bringing civilian agencies in line with the DFARS clause. The other thing that's absent from the FAR clause, reporting requirement. And chances are most scholars and commentators within the last month have said, yeah, we can expect to see a reporting requirement. in the FAR clause when that comes out. Hopefully this will improve uniformity, that there will be a reference to the mapping of those particular NIST and FIF standards we discussed. And finally, in connection with this, this final rule, the implementation period, we don't know whether it's December 17th, or sorry, December 2017 or when, but hopefully we'll find out soon when we get an updated FAR rule. And I'd like to think, if they were speaking to one another, that this will also carry with it at least a December 2017 timeframe for implementation. Okay. Now, the DFARS rule that we looked at, that emanated from 2 interim rules that were published in the Federal Register in 2015. That rule was just made final last week on October 20th, and there were several clarifications and several concerns. These are the last 2 slides we have. The first bullet point here that I'd like to bring to your attention is that you can pursue a variance to these particular requirements if you think that you have an alternative but equally effective security measure. And I thought that that was important. I think others do too, because if you can be creative in coming up with a way to control this information that is not as onerous but equally effective, talk to your contracting officer or the chief information officer and see if you can get a variance. The second regards subcontractor flow down, which we've already talked about, and it's only when you're dealing with covered defense information, but that's not an easy question, as we've discussed. The third point, third clarification, is that really I think that primes and subs are going to have to work together when subs are pursuing a variance. The change in the rule says that if you are a subcontractor and you're pursuing that variance, you need to work through with your primes so they understand exactly what you're doing, because it's obviously going to be affecting their control systems if you, as the prime, are exchanging controlled and classified information and it's subject to a control provision that hasn't been approved or might not otherwise be good enough. Okay. Finally, what are some of the concerns? Covered defense information is too broad, the definition. We talked about this. It was the 4 categories. Now they've gone to the registry. Some of those categories in the registry don't have anything to do with defense, so the defense industry has said, wait a second, this is too broad. How are we going to deal with this? So that's going to be something we have to watch for. We talked about the insufficient protection for contractors forced to share information. This particular program, we didn't talk about the cloud, those contractors who are cloud providers, but that's an entirely separate set of rules. There was a concern regarding lack of clarity for cloud providers that perhaps if we all get together again, we can talk about that. There's interest. And finally, there was I shouldn't say finally, there's one more on the next slide. Failure to address concerns regarding breaches of personally identifiable information revealed in incident reports. This we saw in connection with some of the earlier incidents and breaches that Lisa had discussed, and this remains an ongoing concern, where there are just not sufficient means of addressing breaches when you have personally identifiable information that's revealed in an incident report that you, a prime, are forced to give over to a third-party contractor. It's just, and do you have a question? Exactly. Yeah. What about, I mean, there's a certain thoughtlessness. I don't know, I should be careful. There's a certain thoughtlessness with the way in which these regulations have been enacted, and this is one of them. How is it that, I'm not a HIPAA attorney, but I would imagine. Exactly.
I mean, if you've got 1,000 employees,
yep.
That's crazy.
Right. So in any breach, you turn
especially considering if the breach has taken place over the course of a few years, you've got endless numbers of records on people that have been in that system that you're just passing along.
That's right. It's I like that. It's bad. And then finally, for our small businesses, I included here a comment and a response in connection with the issuance of this final rule. And there was a concern by the SBA Office of Advocacy. So this isn't a contractor, this is the SBA, saying that the cost of compliance with the rule will be a significant barrier to small businesses engaging in federal acquisition process. And look at the answer. It's essentially tough. Deal with it. And I mean, that goes back to what we had talked about earlier. But I think this is here to stay. We're going to have to be mindful in coming up with our compliance programs. And as we go forward, it's never been as clear to me that we need to get involved in the process. I mean, we have the comment process with the regulations. It's a robust dialogue, but even more so with contracting officers and with others to make them understand where these particular controls are simply not feasible, too costly, what have you, they need to change.
The security cost associated with replacing a record or recording that record is like $750 a record in the private sector.
Right.
So it's going to be even higher on this end. I mean, that's a catastrophic close your doors incident.
Right. I mean, and that is the general tenor of the comments that you hear over and over and over again without any meaningful response as to achieving some balance between security and business viability. And it's something that I think we're going to have to wait and see how it evolves. Yes?
I know we're a little bit over time, but we will record this for those that need to leave online, but we'll ask time for a few questions here. We do have a comment from the audience that we'd love to get your thoughts on. US Cert CSET helps map some of this process, I think in addition to the NIST standards, and also reference to EMAS can also be used.
Mm-hmm.
If you have any comments on that.
I don't. I imagine that these are, I've seen that there are consultants and providers that can assist with this mapping because it's no easy task. Those are two organizations that I'm not entirely familiar with, but I'd say let's continue this and we can discuss ways in which contractors and members are dealing with this. It sounds like, if I understand correctly, those are two entities that could assist with that.
I'll remind people online, feel free to enter in a question. Any additional questions in the room?
I can just offer one comment. I can certainly understand cybersecurity, cyberspace is a space open to everybody. And so this is a attempt, I don't know how good it is, an attempt at trying to protect some of our vital information. But when we have access by so many people, it's worse than in the spreading disease. It's much worse than, I know they use virus as similar terminology, but it's far worse than that. You can't know the partner of every partner that has access to any of your data and all their family members and their friends and their kids and their schools and their companies and on and on and on. It's practically impossible. So one approach to it is, well, like you mentioned, the agencies have been tasked with this for a decade or more, and they can't do it. So they're just saying, well, let's shift it. They're always saying the private sector can do it. Well, let's just shift it to them. This will fail because small business, which is the big engine out here, will not be able to cope with it. So I guess the best course is maybe to pursue that variance as much as possible and really encourage, maybe through a PNDC, encourage our members, push back. We are a great advocacy group. We have access to our congressional delegation on many, many occasions, and this should be a top issue for our advocacy committee, and it should be something that we bring up at every single roundtable event.
I think that's right, and one of the reasons why I put that last slide in about the SBA advocacy office is because it struck me that we have, I mean, this isn't totally unique, but we have an agency saying, look, the individuals, the companies that we are intended to protect and develop can't do this. And that may be another pressure point where we could go and talk to our SBA advocates and say, look, you need to continue this. And as far as going and looking at the particular requirements in the FAR, that those 15 that are the basic minimum requirements, there must be a discussion to identify the ways in which they are too onerous, how they should be changed, and perhaps even, I mean, this discussion just illuminates Do we need another rule for small businesses? Do we need another section for small businesses where yes, we recognize our compliance, but these minimum controls are not minimum. They're still not working.
Right, but you see, the small business still has access to the networks and still has access to the system. So it's still going to be a problem.
This is an opportunity to roll back technology.
Yeah.
This is a closed circuit system. This is the idea of passing information along without it being open to the public.
Or it's an opportunity to start a new business on how to make your product a COTS.
Mm-hmm. Right. How to qualify for COTS, right? And then it becomes a non-issue. You have to sell it to somebody else. But I mean, with defense products anyway, that's often.
Well, you can look. I mean, this is all new stuff. I mean, cybersecurity is, at the end of the day, less than a decade old. I mean, you can compare it to other litigious environments, where you do construction or something of that nature, where you've got class action components. And the fact is, this is a moving target that over the course of the next decade or more will be defined further, because you're going to have interagency conflict related to these types of regulations. The people that had ERISA and HIPAA and all these other acts that have been around for a long time are going to come back and say, wait a minute, this doesn't fly.
Right, so forced disclosure in violation of federal statute. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, you'll see those, I think, we may see those challenges in courts. We're going to see those challenges in all sorts of different ways, from the contract level and all the way up. But it's definitely not finished. Like you mentioned, in looking at these various publications, the statute FISMA that more or less started all this was 2002. But the 800-171 publication that we looked at, that's June of 2015. The predecessor document to that is April of 2013, so it's very new. And
there's going to be all kinds of iterations.
Right. And that mapping that we talked about, the 2013 version was directed at the federal agencies. The 2015 version, which we looked at, that's the one directed at non-federal organizations. That's the contractors. And it's, like you mentioned, I don't, there's going to be room for improvement. Let's put it that way, because the mapping and the processing is not as clear as it could be. And the actual compliance, it's like we've been talking about, fiscally, and it's just not possible, perhaps, in every instance. Yes?
We have one last question online. Can you use an outside contractor to assist with implementing and running an insider threat program? If so, does that contractor have to have access to the classified information to within that, implementing that?
So you can use an outside contractor to help you set up the system, but ultimately the compliance obligation has to remain that of the contractor. So you can't substitute an outside vendor for what your responsibilities are. So I guess the defining principle would be process as opposed to substantive access and implementation.
It should be a consultant, not a contractor.
Right.
Yeah. Great, great. Well, thank you so much. We'll go ahead and conclude. Those of us joining in person can definitely continue the conversation over lunch. I will make a few references to upcoming events. Judy, I know you referenced some of our advocacy programs for members. We will have members of Congress out next year where there is opportunities to talk to them one-on-one about how these affect our businesses in the area. We do actually have our annual dinner coming up November 9th in Portland. We're really pleased to have the Undersecretary of Defense responsible for acquisitions, technology, and logistics, so the person in charge of these, among other regulations, coming up. So I invite you all to join us for that. We will also have another webinar on November 10th covering R&D tax credits, opportunities for that. We will have our annual export compliance seminar covering ITAR and EAR exporting requirements on November 30th and December 1st. So lots of opportunities to connect and hear about other programs, as well as we'll of course have our holiday networking lunches coming up in December. All the details are at pndc.us. Thank you all for joining us today, those online and those in person, and Thank you so much. We really appreciate our speakers lending their expertise, obviously, to a complicated subject that is very important to us. And on this last slide is your contact information. If people have further questions, they can definitely get in touch with you. Thank you. We will end the webinar portion now.
Very good.
So we have lunch for folks, so we hope you'll help yourself.
Hang around for